Anyone even tangentially involved in the TRPG space, unless you've been living under a rock, will have heard about the recent controversy around 1D&D and the OGL. Just in case you have been living under a rock, the OGL is one of the biggest reasons that D&D has been able to survive over the years and has enabled the community to make their own additions to the various editions and keep a higher level of content flow than just WotC would be able to do alone. With the upcoming release of 1D&D, the next edition of D&D, Hasbro, the current owners of WotC, decided to announce the removal of the current OGL and require royalties from all third-party creators. I know they said they're backing off, but we've seen this before from them and other companies, so it's safe to assume that they're going to keep trying, especially because they kept trying to placate us with crumbs rather than withdrawing it entirely. I'm not going to go too much into detail on that topic because it would take a long time, is incredibly stupid, and require it to be the focus of the video. Rather, I'm going to do as the title suggests and take the opportunity to say something that I've been trying to say for more than a decade.
D&D is not a one-size-fits-all system and never has been.
The single largest mistake I've seen people make over the 20-odd years I've spent playing D&D is assuming that it's the best option for their TRPG game simply because it's D&D. There are things that D&D does well, and in some cases better than any other system. But not only does that change per edition, but there are some things that D&D has literally never done well and never will. A great example of this is how D&D is, at its core, a pass-fail system. You either hit an enemy or miss, you either make a saving throw or fail. If you tried to have, say, a detective game with the D&D system, it would just be a huge string of feel-bad moments where the DM either just has the players miss vital clues because they rolled one lower than the DC, or ignore any failed roll in order to keep things moving. And before anyone says something, I'm going off of rules as written, so your homebrew setting or rule of cool, both of which my group uses quite liberally, mind you, don't count for this. So let's go over the most popular archetypes the bulk of home games tend to cover. I'm not going to discuss Pathfinder because if you play D&D, you probably know what that is, and if you don't, it's D&D but with more rules. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Yes. Quick note, the order isn't indicating which one I like the most, just how I decided to order it. Nor are these the only options, just the ones that I'm most familiar with. Investigation and Heist. A more niche choice compared to some of the others I've seen, but no less fun. It's a perfect example of something that, as I said earlier, D&D is not and has never been built for. With any good mystery or heist media, a large part of why it's fun is not just figuring out how to solve the problem, but also dealing with every situation exploding in your face without it killing you. Gonna start with the elephant in the room, Call of Cthulhu. It is the go-to for people who generally don't want to play D&D and aren't a furry. I know this because if someone plays Call of Cthulhu, don't worry, they'll let you know. While I do like the system, it's very obviously the closest analog to D&D for these sorts of games that you're gonna get, mostly with the death and dismemberment thing as you see horrors both unknown and man-made. As a result, also like D&D, people try to make Call of Cthulhu fit every type of mystery and or heist thing they can think of, which isn't great when your players are likely to get off before they can figure out the mystery or escape with the priceless treasure. While there are a ton of options, the ones that I've specifically picked out cover low to no magic, modern day, futuristic, or full-on fantasy settings. You enjoy the X-Files, Twin Peaks, or the more clandestine parts of XCOM? Then Delta Green is your game. As a contemporary version of Call of Cthulhu, it is much more lethal than most TRPGs out there, though compared to Call of Cthulhu, I find it's far easier to survive in Delta Green, so it does lend itself to longer form games. Personally, my favorite thing about Delta Green is the vibe. Your party is specifically people who are meant to deal with issues both of this world and beyond. So while it is deadly, you are never truly meant to be completely out of your depth and at a loss of what to do. Worst comes to worst, just give them the old. If you want a more classical, hard-boiled detective story like Phoenix Wright, LA Noire,
You fuck young boys, Valdez. Are you a madman?
or the Scooby-Doo gang, then Gumshoe is what you'll want. What I like the most about Gumshoe is something that I think most TRPG players can relate to. I know everyone has had a puzzle room in a TRPG game that the DM has assumed you all would figure out easily, but none of you thought about it the way the DM thought you would, and so you're stuck in that godforsaken room, and after 3 hours, 2 players are screaming at each other, one is slumped over the table drunk, another has given up and is scrolling on their phone. Meanwhile, you're crying in the corner because you somehow know that this is your fault, and sorry, where was I? Oh, right. So basically it's just a thing where the party gets stuck and the DM doesn't quite know how to move things along without just telling you all the solution. Gumshoe is a built-in system to allow the DM to move the story along when enough clues have been found, meaning your players don't have to find everything, making it very hard to ruin the flow, which is vitally important, in my opinion, to a good mystery. Did you ever see that episode of Futurama where it's revealed that Bender begins to break down and die if he sobers up, and you wondered what RPing that might be like? For that weirdly specific example example, and many others like it, let me introduce you to Unknown Armies. This system I really like because of how the general vibe in the setting meshes with the rules. Going with my example, there is a type of wizard that has to maintain at least a buzz at all times in order to cast magic. If you sober up ever, then you lose your magic until you start drinking again. Another is the Segs Wizard. No, it's not what you're thinking, but the magic actually comes from actively blue-balling yourself, making it so the more pent up you are, the more powerful your magic becomes. And lastly, do you want to play Corvo, Ezio, or form your own cult in order to steal sacred relics from a temple in order to summon your patron god, Shannon? Then you can't go wrong with Blades in the Dark. I do think that people who prefer more RP to rules-heavy games would especially like it, because the skill system is fairly open-ended and it's kind of up to you and your DM to work out what you want to do and how to use your existing skills to accomplish it. Also, for the boomer nerds, this is the closest to a Thief tabletop RPG you're going to find, and that's Thief as you remember it. Not Thief that gives up on level design after a point and forces you into mazes to kill farting dinosaurs. For those of you that haven't played Thief, no, it's not nearly as cool or funny as it sounds. Exploration and hexcrawl games are much closer to what your average 5th edition player has experienced. These are very much the systems where your DM makes a map, fills it with nightmarish creatures beyond human comprehension, and you all decide it's a great place for an afternoon stroll. The systems designed with this in mind are rolling with the fact that you're not going to become some JRPG protagonist who is able to punch God in the face by the end, but rather you're struggling the whole time, with your progression coming in forms that make it so you hurt yourself less when you try to do something cool or dangerous, but also for loot. If I were to compare this to a video game, these would be much more your XCOM, Advanced Wars, Darkest Dungeon, all of the ones where the goal is to make yourself better at survival with the knowledge that some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice the rest of you are willing to make. A lot of people want a system with minimal frills so that they can be far more flexible with their RP or rule of cool modes of play, or just enjoy the sort of fantasy movies that, while good, aren't always terribly deep. If this sounds like the stuff you're into, then Dungeon Crawl Classic is the system tailor-made for that. It's a very rules-light, non-intrusive RPG that has enough set in stone to guide the player and has a grid-focused combat system, while not having such hard and fast rules that it feels like playing a railroading video game. For the games where you're all dirt farmers who need some extra cash in order to save the local town orphanage, while at the same time not becoming more powerful than Satan, this is a great choice. It's hard to go wrong with a classic. Are you an enjoyer of wizardry, the Fallout and Elder Scrolls games, the exploration bit, not the story bit, or any game where being a murder hobo and loot goblin is your peak performance? Time to check out Torchbearer. This is one of the more crunchy games in this style and is not built for having a deep, meaningful story. No, this is a lot closer to the real old-school dungeon crawls where the whole point is exploring the wilds, finding ancient ruins and caves, slaughtering the native inhabitants, all to obtain the shiny stuff hidden within. This in particular is far more lethal than any other hex crawler I've seen, so I can only suggest this if you're the type of person that enjoys difficult gameplay that greatly rewards system mastery and punishes careless actions. Are you interested in the open world aspect of TRPGs, but also wish that there were well thought out main story areas that allowed you to interact with the plot? Do you like The Witcher? Then let me introduce you to Forbidden Lands. This is not a very mechanically complex system, but it has a rich content map full of random and preset encounters, allowing you to just pick a direction and wander, not having to worry about missing out. Setting-wise, my personal favorite bit is that with some of the pre-built adventures, it actually rewards your players for figuring out what the bad guy's plan is before it happens. I'm not going to spoil anything here because that'd be rude as hell, but even if you don't want to play this setting, it's by far one of my favorites to read for ideas in my other games. For those of you that are struggling with finding a way to keep the pace of the game going and want there to be actually no wrong answer to what path you choose, you'll find the Forbidden Lands quite welcoming. Tactical combat and dungeon crawl games are really interesting to me. They stand out from traditional D&D and hex crawlers because the games tend to not be based around the idea of dungeon delving or having a persistent combat-ready area that your players move through. It sacrifices the moving around on a larger grid area in a dungeon in exchange for having a significantly more focused and refined experience in the actual combat itself. So you'll RP your way through a dungeon instead of having to wait for a rogue to roll 30 stealth checks while the rest of you are falling asleep waiting for something to happen. And when you get hit with a combat zone, then the map is brought out. What's great about this, to me, is that it allows for RP to be far more flexible and run via rule of cool, but at the same time not giving up combat complexity. To give an example as to why you aren't expected to fully map out a giant dungeon for combat, it's because each of these systems, to some extent, are expected to have tactical features. While in D&D, you can hide behind stuff, there are entire rules sections dedicated to the environment with these systems and how you can interact with it. You know how everyone ignores encumbrance rules that interact with terrain in D&D? Here, they just build it into the terrain rules that flow with the general engine of the game, combat. I'm gonna get the obvious one for this section out of the way first. 4th edition D&D might surprise some people by being included in a list of TRPGs you should check out that aren't D&D. Because I'll be the first person to admit that it had one of, if not the worst launches of any major TRPG ever. There were several compounding factors as to why this happened, most of which were out of the designer's hands, so in no way am I trying to put fault on them. Even setting aside some of the honestly really darker stuff that happened during development, 4th edition was insanely ambitious in that without the D&D name, you couldn't really recognize it from any earlier incarnation. Building anything from basically the ground up is already a Herculean task, and a TRPG is harder than most. Those of you that remember the Heartbreaker era of TRPGs will know what I'm talking about. The earlier books are honestly still really bad. The first Monster Manual is pretty much unusable, but everything else after launch was frankly stellar. It's a real shame that it got double tapped to the back of the head by WotC when it had been on a freaking tear of improvement. Also, sadly, finding online support for 4th Ed compared to the other editions is insanely hard. So if you can find any books on sale at a secondhand bookstore, your local game store, or some cheap PDFs online, would love for more people to give this system a shot because it got shafted harder than millennials who graduated in 2008. Do you want 5th edition, but with more clear-cut rules and less ask your GM cop-outs that were rampant in the earlier books? Then play Strike. Actually, just play Strike instead of 5th Ed. It's a grid-based combat system that, in the book, tries to get people not to argue against the spirit of the rules. It's way less mechanically demanding than 4th Ed, and is a fairly robust system of character creation that sets out general ideas so that you're allowed to reskin character classes and abilities as you please. So you don't need to try and force 3 different classes to let you play in Among Us. You just pick the class that has all the tools you want, and then you're free to flavor it however you wish. Really, Strike is the 5th edition of 4th Ed. It's the idea that your build choices open new options in both combat and RP without sacrificing one for the other, but also wish you could handwave RP or combat when it begins to drag. You want to fly giant robots to blow things up? Can't go wrong with Lancer. It's a sci-fi RPG with mech-focused gameplay that has an in-depth system for RP, combat, and extended downtime. It does this by having different independent systems and scale for each of them. So if you want to have a Gurren Lagann type grandiose mech battles, but still at the same time have characters who are hobos that survive off of dive bar food, you can. Honestly, I haven't had too much time to play around with Lancer in actual games, but it is a really interesting system, and honestly, D20 Modern was hilariously bad, and Shadowrun is super inconsistent on what parts are good or bad. I'm in the camp that the Super Soaker tank that sprayed gallons of narcotics on people was peak gameplay, but I seem to be in the minority. So Lancer being as well built as it is in an already desolate wasteland of good designs for this type of game means it shines all the brighter. If you like 4th edition but wished it played just a little different, play 13th Age. That's it. That's the post. Political and relationship intrigue games aren't really my thing, so I can't speak with too much authority on them. The one that people are most aware of is the World of Darkness system. I have played a few games in it, and I can see the appeal. Its biggest strength is that it's what got women into the TRPG space to begin with. This isn't me saying women didn't play D&D in the 70s and 80s, but D&D had an extended period of time where they very obviously didn't even pretend to write anything with women in mind. World of Darkness, on the other hand, very much did. Who knew that all it took was a bunch of sad, pretty goth vampire boys talking about their feelings? As a result of World of Darkness's success, more and more TRPGs began to realize that they needed to write with women in mind because, wouldn't you know it, there just happened to be a few of them. My one word of warning for World of Darkness is, for the love of all that is holy, do not mix systems. Not at least until you have a provable system mastery. Once we had a game with a mummy, werewolf, vampire, geist, mage, and a homebrew mad scientist thing. We kept running into issues where people would just be useless in most encounters until their one thing came up. Though it was funny how we doomed the world in like 6 different ways in the span of 2 in-game hours. This was a lot longer than I was expecting, if I'm being honest. But even with what's here, I cut some stuff out that I wanted to talk about or go into more detail. The fact that I didn't spend a ton of time on any one section and it was still this long is really just proof that the TRPG space is enormous and is very much worth your time to check out other systems. I know it can feel daunting learning whole new systems. I've been there, currently am. So honestly, I hope some of you just pick up some of these source books to read through. People trying to force D&D to do things it wasn't built to do end up just trying to reinvent the wheel and fix a problem someone else already fixed 20 years ago. At worst, reading these books just gives you more insight on the larger TRPG space, while at best, you might find a new favorite system, or find a way to incorporate a unique and interesting system into your already running campaign. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Lamentations of the Flame Princess is great for getting off on the suffering of women and excels at